This is the first parish church in Brunswick, Maine, and its significance to the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin is that in many ways the story began here. It's here in this pew, pew number 23, that Harriet Beecher Stowe, by her account, saw a vision of Uncle Tom being whipped to death. Now, Uncle Tom, as you probably know, is the title character, the hero of her 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin is that there was this slave, a very, very good slave, who is sold by his first kind owner, Mr. Shelby. He's sold downriver in order for him to pay debts on his plantation. And through a series of misadventures, you might say, he ends up in the hands of a very unruly owner who is so irritated by him and his goodness that he whips him to death. And this is the scene out of which the entire novel, in many respects, grows. Harriet Beecher Stowe came from a family, a very religious family, the Beechers, who were located in Ohio, where she grew up. And they were a highly religious family, and they were an anti-slavery family. She was married to Calvin Stowe, who was a theology professor, doctor of divinity, and her whole understanding of both the spiritual world in which she moved and lived was all dictated by God, by the hand of God. And she often said, as she said about Uncle Tom's Cabin, that it wasn't her who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, but the hand of God who wrote this novel, because she had this very specific idea that slavery was wrong, morally wrong, and that it should be abolished regardless of what the laws of the state, of the country said at the time. She came to Brunswick because her husband, Calvin Stowe, got a job at Bowdoin College to be a professor there. He didn't come with her, however. He stayed in Ohio and then later moved to Andover in order to complete his contract there as a professor. And she came without him with their children, and she was also 6 months pregnant. And she moved to Brunswick in order to take up residence here, awaiting the arrival of her husband. From the stories that were told of Harriet Beecher Stowe is that she was, a small, petite woman, and she didn't take much care in terms of how she dressed. She was a very intense woman. But she was also very much a woman of her time. She was known then, really mostly as a housewife. She was totally overwhelmed with the number of children she had. She had 7, and she was pregnant. So that's what you would have seen, an overworked housewife and mother who came to worship here, probably with her children and her sister, Catherine Beecher, who eventually moved in with her. And they all came and worshiped here in this church. Think about when we first meet Uncle Tom's Cabin in his hut. He's not really in a cabin, he's in a slave hut. What is he doing? He's learning to read the Bible. And it is in the Bible, or the Bible is kind of an intertext for Uncle Tom's Cabin, because what we do, right and wrong, is what this novel is telling us to do. And one thing that irritates people about Uncle Tom's Cabin is how didactic it is. Several times in which the narrator, Stowe, appears in the novel herself to say, "Now, reader, what would you do in this situation? Would you do the right thing or the wrong thing?" And that kind of moral order is what she's recreating in Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's really kind of writing a new Bible for the mid-19th century, given the conflict over slavery that the nation is facing. We're at number 63 Federal Street, and we're at the house of Harriet Beecher Stowe, where she lived and worked in 1850. And it was also known as the Titcomb House because it's named after the original owners, the Titcombs, and she rented this house from him. And he just lived down the road over there. And he did most of actually the repairs on the house when she lived here. She needed a new sink, she needed a new stove. The house was when she moved in, and she complained about its state of disrepair. It was drafty, cold. But over time, she slowly managed to do some renovations herself, and she wrote funny letters back to her friends and family about how hard it was to get people to help her with these repairs, because you have to get into this long conversation. She said it was the epitome of Yankeedom, you know, to get anybody to help her out. She paid $125 a month for this house, which was much more than they could afford. They thought it would be about $75 a month. And she just lived here for 2 years. She lived here with her children. Calvin, her husband, eventually came. Also her sister, Catherine Beecher, came and lived with her too. So it was a house that was just chock full of people. And we'll go inside and you'll see that it is a pretty big home that could accommodate a lot of people, but maybe not that many people. So here we are in the house, and there's very little of this that would have looked like this when Stowe was here. It was completely renovated. The carpet, the staircase was even transformed. There are some original wallpapers underneath, but even that doesn't date back to Stowe's time. So the house has just gone through many incarnations, and but it was important to her, of course, because it was where she was able to think and write about her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. For me, one of the important features of this house is the kitchen, because the kitchen is for Stowe, a writer of domestic fiction, a housewife herself, and a mother. It's really the home and hearth of who she was. And it was in the kitchen, and we don't know if this was the original kitchen by any means, but it was in the kitchen that Stowe conducted her own classes. She taught her children herself, a sort of old-style form of homeschooling, but also invited children from the neighborhood to think and work with her. She gave readings, both of her own stuff that she was writing, but also she would read aloud from the Bible, from the novels of Sir Walter Scott, the Waverley novels, for instance. So this was really the place where it all happened, where it all took place, where Uncle Tom, though he died, you might say, at the First Parish Church, came alive in this house. She was a pretty fast writer. She wrote this in installments, remember? So she would just write chapter by chapter, not unlike the way Dickens would write. He would write as things sort of occurred to him and send them in immediately. She needed time and space to think and work, and she didn't have a lot of that. So she would have to squeeze in her writing in between, you know, taking care of her children, cooking, cleaning, doing all these other things at the same time. And that was something that's, you know, so how do you squeeze in these in the wee hours of the morning or very late at night? That's probably when she wrote. She had a kind of dedication to the craft, to writing. And if you read her stuff, you know, she wrote in such an engaging manner, work that could actually be read by people like her, by her children. You know, Uncle Tom's Cabin is also a great children's story. And that's who she was writing for. She was writing to kind of educate young people on the politics and social situation of her time. I'd say she was middle class, I guess, but she was, before the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, they were living off of Calvin's salary, which wasn't really very much. It was really after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin where she became a sensation, the most famous author in America, if not the world, you know, because she then went on a tour of Great Britain. I mean, this novel brought her great fame, and with it came considerable prosperity, though it would have been more if there was, you know, if she had negotiated a better contract with her publishers, et cetera, et cetera. But she continued to write, and she wrote prolifically after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Before that novel, she had mostly just written sketches for these magazines and things like that. But this was her first big novel. After that, she wrote several. And all of these were income-generating novels. So she was a woman, yes, and she was a housewife who didn't have much of an income. But after Uncle Tom's Cabin, she became prosperous. And her house, her real house, you might say, the house she didn't rent, but the house that she built over in Hartford, Connecticut, is basically a testament to her, her prosperity that came after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is where she lived before, which says a lot about, you know, what the novel did for her personally, which is nothing to be sneezed at. Well, Bowdoin College acquired this house a few years ago, and they're in the process of renovating it and making it accessible to the public. So that's still undergoing conversation, and it remains in process. But we hope that something will come of the house to make it accessible for people in Maine and those who are curious about the novel and the woman who wrote it. The community of Brunswick really welcomed Stowe with open arms. Not only was she a spouse of someone who worked at the college, but in her own right, there was something about her, I think, that appealed to the neighbors. And I think that she might have been something of an eccentric, you know. There are stories of her being really harried looking, you know, not having combed her hair, because she was doing so many things at the same time. But there was something, I think, quite lovely about her, and she formed friendships with people in the neighborhood in Brunswick. So that's another part of the legacy of Stowe in Brunswick. The third and last stop on our Brunswick tour, our Stowe tour of Brunswick. And we're here in Special Collections with Richard Lindeman, and we're just going to look at some of the documents to see how the novel evolved, first as a serial in the newspaper The National Era, published out of Washington, D.C. And as I said before, this is how she sent in chapter by chapter, and it became increasingly popular. So it had no intention of becoming a full-fledged novel. It was just going to be a serial that was published in the newspaper. But because it was so popular, it transformed into a full-fledged novel. And in the first year, in 1852, and this is the first edition, when it was first published, in the first week it sold 10,000 copies. And by the end of the year, I think it was 300,000 copies.
And has never gone out of print since.
That's right.
So it has continued to be popular over time. The National Era had a smaller audience, I think maybe around 15,000 subscribers, but that wouldn't include the whole number of readers because families eagerly awaited the Friday mail so that the National Era, when it came, could be read as a group and they could follow along on the serialization of the story. These are serial editions. They're cheap paperbacks, if you will. Typically were sold in railway stalls and other book markets and in urban centers, which allowed an increasingly literate British reading public to read popular novels and to buy them affordably. And if you would think about them as serial soap operas, they tended to be that kind of fiction.
Domestic fiction was the most popular form of fiction, really, in the mid-19th century.
Hawthorne, in fact, expressed great annoyance at the success of Harriet Beecher Stowe's popularity because he considered her a second-rate hack, and nobody was really appreciating his first-rate literature. And it's well past the time when women needed to use pseudonyms and publish under male names. There was a higher acceptance and a greater success rate among women writers in the mid and late 19th century.
I think that this is probably one of the most influential works of literary fiction in American history. As we talked about before, Lincoln's famous statement about it, but not just in 1852. The popularity, as Richard was saying, was something that has come right to the present in the 1890s during the Jim Crow era. Uncle Tom's Cabin again became a very important novel for African Americans to articulate civil rights. It exerted an enormous influence not just on other writers, but on leading political figures and social activists. So without Uncle Tom's Cabin, Turget's novel, Bricks Without Straw, was written very much to model. He wanted to model his work during the Reconstruction era after Uncle Tom's Cabin. James Baldwin famously in 1955, publishes a screed against Uncle Tom's Cabin. But for him too, in the 1950s, he says no novel has ever exerted an influence over him like the power of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's really the sentimental power of this novel that lasts very much to the present day.